Hello, and welcome to our panel on fighting and winning in space. I'm Kevin Chilton, and I have the honor of moderating this session with a phenomenal lineup of Air Force leaders. But before we begin, I'd like to briefly recall a bit of history to set the context for today's panel. Back in September of 1985, during the height of the Cold War, the Department of Defense established a new unified command called U.S. Space Command, under the command of General Robert Harries. After 17 years of operations, the command was inactivated in October of 2002, and its missions were moved to U.S. Strategic Command. Most recently, the command was reactivated on the 29th of August of last year, with General J. Raymond named as the commander. And on July 28th of this year, the U.S. Senate confirmed Lieutenant General James Dickinson, U.S. Army, to be the next commander of U.S. Space Command. Certainly a lot of things have changed over the years since the command first stood up during the Reagan administration. Back in 1985, the U.S. was talking about the development and deployment of an on-orbit missile defense system known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And both the US and the Soviets were experimenting and demonstrated anti-satellite systems. The notion that space could become a contested domain was on the minds of both countries' leaders. But with the end of the Cold War, the Soviet threat went away. And in the US policy arena, so did all discussions about the potential for combat operations in space. Nevertheless, the subsequent commanders, all of whom are with us today, continue to call for the US to prepare for an inevitable challenge to US freedom of action in space. In 1998, China, having watched how effectively the US integrated space capabilities into our military operations in Kuwait and the Balkans, wrote a white paper that essentially recognized that China would likely not be able to go toe-to-toe with US combat forces in the air, land, and sea domains. And so they would instead look to develop capabilities that would neutralize the advantages we had in space and in our ability to command and control all our forces. The Chinese recognized that as a military, and indeed as a nation, our space capabilities were no longer just a convenience, but had become a dependency. Nevertheless, US policy continued to discourage and at times even prohibited any discussions about the possibility of warfare in space. Then in 2007, the Chinese demonstrated their direct ascent anti-satellite capability. Still, we hesitated until our policy was finally changed in 2014. The new US policy finally recognized that space was no longer a sanctuary, but that indeed it had become a contested domain, and that we needed to take action to protect the space capabilities we had in fact become so heavily dependent upon. And to add to the urgency for us to take action, it was recently revealed that the Russians have begun testing their own anti-satellite systems again. So it is with some relief that we see the recognition of this new reality in the mission statement of our newest combatant command, U.S. Space Command, which states, "The mission of U.S. Space Command is to conduct operations in, from, and to space to deter conflict and, if necessary, defeat aggression, deliver space combat power for the joint and combined force, and defend U.S. vital interests with allies and partners." Today, we are fortunate to have with us 5 former commanders of U.S. Space Command who have offered to share their views on what it will take for this new command to fight and win in space. Assembled virtually with me today, we have General Charles Chuck Horner, who commanded U.S. Space Command from 92 to 94, General Joe Ashey, who was in command from 94 to 96, General Howell Estes, who commanded from 96 to 98, General Dick Myers, who commanded from 98 to 2000, and General Ed Eberhardt, who commanded between 2000 and 2002. And to begin our panel today, I'd like to ask a series of questions of our panelists, and General Horner, I'd like to pick on you first. Sir, Desert Storm is often referred to as the first war where US space capabilities played an important role, particularly in delivering weather observations from space, over the horizon comms, and precision navigation and timing from the GPS constellation, particularly to support land forces transiting featureless desert terrain and the now famous left hook executed to surround the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. Yet coming out of the decisive air campaign that you led prior to the ground invasion, you expressed disappointment at the lack of support from space-based reconnaissance assets to provide your planners pre-strike targeting and post-strike battle damage assessment. I suspect the tension over the prioritization of these limited assets to support national intelligence requirements over operational warfighter requirements continues today. Do you have any thoughts, sir, on how U.S. Space Command should approach this issue? And do you see it as their responsibility to not only develop space situational awareness, but to use space to find ways to support the geographic combatant commanders with their SA?
Well, there's no doubt about it. Desert Storm was our first space war in that we had offensive and defensive operations relating to space assets. For example, we denied the Iraqis the ability to receive space information by bombing their ground sites, their satellite download sites, and we exploited heavily the intelligence, navigation, communications assets that space provides us. One star in the whole war was the cooperation between U.S. and Air Force Space Command, NORAD, and the National Security Agency to provide us missile warning, which was a kludged up system, but it was very effective in terms of organizing our defenses and providing the alerts we needed to give the civil people, civil defense people in both Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Bahrain. The Cold War problems, the problems we had with space assets originally because of the Cold War organization and procedures we had. For example, limited coverage. The head of the mapping agency came to me before the war ever came about, and he said, if you ever go to war in the Middle East, you're not going to have any good maps because all our satellite imagery is on Russia and Europe. And as a result, we didn't have good maps for using space assets. Also, it's not very timely because in Cold War, you're dealing with peacetime operations. And so example, it didn't work for finding mobile targets, for example. It's just too long to get the information to the shooters. And finally, the classification on our space assets really inhibited our combined operation. But fortunately, there was an emerging commercial market which allowed us to have space imagery that we were able to share with everybody in the coalition. If space is to be a value in regional combat, it's got to become more responsive, more accurate, and shareable. I think the space people have to, again, understand the difference between being a service and a warfighting command, because they tend to be more one of a service than a warfighting command. But services don't fight wars. Components do. Component elements of the regional combat commands, of which space would be one. The components are required to plan and execute the battle wherever there's land, sea, air, force, space. They have to have components for the particular regional commander involved. And space is going to require to provide both component commanders to the regional commanders and also land, sea, and airspace components have to be provided to Space Command. So I think that we'll work this out. There has been progress, but I'm concerned now that we take a closer look at information operations. Space is 100% information operations. And information operations are going to be conducted by everyone involved in any kind of a conflict, where we deny the enemy, we deceive the enemy, or we preclude him from having access to data. And the trouble is these efforts are all highly classified and they step on one another if not coordinated. So the combatant commands, to include space, are going to need a clearinghouse for these kind of operations that are being conducted by a multitude of people, not just military people. And therefore, I think the space component commander is the person to serve that person, not to control them, but to provide the combatant commander information about what's going on and what's dysfunctional and what's functional, what's working and shouldn't be tried. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. If I could follow up on your last comment there, it reminds me of General Dunford, our past chairman's efforts to address what he called global integration in a fight. Do you see a role beyond what you just described for U.S. Space Command to be part, or if not the lead integrator of information and knitting together things around the globe that support a regional combatant fight, say in the South China Sea?
Well, I think that it's important that if you have a conflict in a region, whether it be space or Pacific or Europe, that regional commander, combatant commander, have the say about what's going on in this area. And if there's disagreement between, say, an agency in Washington and a regional commander, then it's up to the Secretary of Defense and the President to resolve. But somebody needs to know what's going on.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Now, I'd like to turn now to General Ashley, who followed you in command. Sir, you came, like General Horner, you brought experience as a coalition air component commander in combat operations out of the Balkans when you came to take command of U.S. Space Command. And I was wondering, sir, given those experiences that you had, were you asked about considerations for establishing a separate Space Force and the reestablishment of U.S. Space Command by General Raymond as he was weighing these things? And if so, what advice did you offer him?
Well, thank you, and howdy from the Republic of Texas. It's great to be a part of this group. I note that we have a distinguished panel chairman here, who is the only one amongst us that's actually been in the battle space, called space. Not too many people have. So that's another story, Chili, and be fun to tell it sometime, different place. Before I start, I'd like to also thank General Raymond for that document that they just put out on space doctrine. If we hadn't taken a look at it, I recommend. It's well done, and it really clears up a lot of things that I think we all clearly wanted to say, which we can today, which leads to your question. So yes, he called, he was gracious. During the run-up to the establishment of a new service and the reestablishment of U.S. Space Command, which spent some time in U.S. Strategic Command for a while, I was taken aback at the narrative coming out of our nation's capital to the point where some, based on the statements and the opinion pieces that were written, I finally called Generals Wright and Deptula and said, this is a bit confusing, and if I got this wrong, and they said, no, you don't, it is. So at points, I really didn't know whether to laugh or cry based on the confusion about the law as it pertains to how we handle military affairs per U.S. law. I'm talking about a service, which General Horner just mentioned, doesn't have any missions. It has the responsibility to organize, train, equip, and provision those who have the combatant requirement in the unified command structure. In fact, I checked in with General Myers, and he's a stern paper grader, and he said, I got this right. So basically, this is something that I think needed to be cleared up in this run-up based on exactly what General Horner said about who does what. The issue from my perspective is that the articles and assets that we have in the recognized joint operational domain of space belong to a whole bunch of people. And I remember General Horner getting the question, I think, Chuck, it was in a hearing, I don't know for sure, when somebody said, General, who's in charge? And you said, I think, a whole lot of people, rightly. The one thing that can't be a whole lot of people in my mind is when it comes to defending it now, which is in this document, which now we can all talk about it and it's recognized, it has to be one person, and that's the President of the United States, who's duly elected, that operates through a confirmed civilian Secretary of Defense with advice and counsel and knowledge by the chairman to the combatant commander. So in my back and forth with General Raymond, he said he's made great progress on this in terms of what goes in the Unified Command Plan, and I think it's reflected in this document. Recently, we've just checked in with him, and he tells us that's basically what has happened, and that's really good news. The reason for that is if we don't construct a command and control system with all this cast of stakeholders under his unity of effort goal as the commander of defense charged by the president, then we're not going to be successful. So I know this leads to a lot of other questions, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks, sir. If I could follow up briefly, would that mean, in your view, and I think I know the answer to this, is if a U.S. civilian-owned satellite were to come under attack, or a NASA civil satellite were to come under attack, that it would be U.S. Space Command commander's responsibility to defend those just as much as the Department of Defense and national security assets that are up there today?
Well, certainly it depends on the guidance, obviously, from the president ultimately, but yes, I mean, so the four sectors are private, commercial, civil, and now, and certainly remaining the military, including the intelligence function, which is another thing we could discuss about, which has not been cleared up, but I think recently it has. So we have no county option. So although the combatant commander can't own all of these objects, when it comes to defending them, he's the one that has to do it by law. So I'm talking about U.S. assets. So the answer is yes. And I think the document, if you've looked at it, says this.
Yeah, it's an excellent document. I'm really proud of the folks that put it together, and I commend it to the audience. If they haven't read it, it's out there, it's available, it's unclassified, and as you say, I believe it's cleared up a lot.
If I can butt in just on that point, just having recently read it, I think it's something that's understandable, lays it out really well, and something I think we can all do in consonance with the association is get this, since it gives us a narrative, I think we need to work on refreshing ourselves on it and helping them teach it to a lot of other people who have agenda that really aren't going to read it.
Great.
Anyway, that's my view.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. General Estes, I have a question for you. You follow General Ashe. In fact, I think the day you departed command was the day I arrived to the command as an action officer on the staff. Sir, I remember during your time though in command, you argued that space should become an area of responsibility, much like a geographic combatant commanders, and that the commander of U.S. Space Command should have authorities similar to the geographic commanders over the space AOR. And it would appear to me that you're just about 20 years ahead of your time is all. Now that the policy has changed and has recognized space as a warfighting domain, can you give us your thoughts on how the authorities of U.S. Space Command differ between the time when you were in command and what they are today? And in your view, what are the implications of these changes?
Yeah, Julie, thanks very much for the question. I guess I would start by saying there may be some that think we were 20 years ahead of our time back in the late 90s, but those of us that were there, and myself included, would say it took 20 years for people to catch up to what we were thinking about. It's sort of the opposite. And I'll explain why I say that. The UCP responsibilities that we had, that we worked on with the Joint Staff and with the chairman, are pretty similar to what they have today, with a couple of exceptions. And let me sort of go back to the late 90s now and explain what I'm talking about. In 1997, leading up to the UCP redo, which was coming out in January, as I remember, of 1998, I was asked by the Secretary of Defense to do a mission validation of the missions we had at U.S. Space Command. We went through that process the last half of 97 and briefed the result of that to the Secretary of Defense, to the Chairman and the Joint Chiefs, and to the combatant commanders. There were two missions that we had specifically, which will be recognizable by everybody here on this video. One was space control, and the other was force application, that were validated. And those two missions really required a place that they be done. And so my argument was, didn't have to be done in space, but it could be done in space. And as time goes on, it's more likely those missions are going to be done in space. And so you needed a place to do it. You needed an AOR, you needed an area of responsibility, just like every other geographical sink has an area of responsibility, so that you can get to what General Horner and General Ashe were talking about of unity of command. Because if something happens, you don't need everybody up there trying to fight the fight. And so I made that argument at the time. What happened in the UCP that came out in January of 1998 was U.S. Space Command got all of the same responsibilities as every other geographical combatant commander. Even though we were a functional combatant command, we got the same responsibilities as the geographical combatant commanders did, with a couple of exceptions. One of them was non-combatant evacuation operations and humanitarian relief operations. Obviously, didn't make any sense for space, especially back in the late 90s. Who knows the future holds? Could be applicable then. However, the decision on the AOR was not given to us. And the reason for that was there were politics at play, which said, you know, the US doesn't want to be the one viewed as, quote, weaponizing space. And so the White House decided that we would not get an AOR. That was carried down through the Secretary of Defense and to the Joint Staff when they did the UCP. So we had all the same authorities at U.S. Space Command as every other combatant commander, save the two I mentioned, and we were not given the AOR. We were in de facto given the AOR because we were given the responsibilities to do these things in space. So I think there's a lot of similarity between what Jay Raymond has today as the U.S. Space Command commander in terms of responsibilities and what we had in the late 90s. And so I see a lot of similarities, as I said. The big change, and that's what you asked for, the big change is the establishment of U.S. Space Command as a geographical combatant command, and the establishment of space as an AOR above 100 kilometers, which is an interesting number because, as I remember, Chili, you're wearing wings, which you got at 80 kilometers, right?
Well,
not 100.
it was 50 nautical miles.
59, yeah, so 80 kilometers. Yeah, I don't know why they picked 100. I don't know, maybe somebody knows, but 100 is the number that was put out there in terms of the
Right.
UCP that's out there now and the responsibilities that General Raymond has. So I hope that answers the question, and I'd be glad to take any other questions you might have or anybody else.
Great. But let me just, one quick follow-up. Is there any authority that you think has not been granted, or, you know, just a clean sheet that you think would be a good thing to be granted to U.S. Space Command commander going forward?
You know, I would tell you the unity of command issue that we've talked about is the key issue. And as long as the U.S. Space Commander has that unity of command and is responsible for space operations, whether it's in support of national security space, commercial assets that belong to the United States or are value to us, to do what needs to be done, and we have one focal point, that to me is the key issue going forward. And from everything I can read, Jay Raymond has that responsibility as the U.S. Space Command commander.
Great. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your thoughts.
You're welcome.
General Myers, I'll tee you up next, sir. Serving on your staff, I recall you had some big rocks in your end baskets that kept you occupied when you were in command of Space Command, NORAD, and U.S. Space Command. One of them was the first launch of the North Korean Taepodong-1. The command also got a new cyber mission while you were there. We were in the throes of birthing SBIRS to replace the DSP constellation, AEHF to replace Milstar, and the ELV program was being developed, which obviously resulted in two great rockets, the Delta IV and Atlas V. And I certainly the next commander of the reestablished U.S. Space Command will have an equally full in basket with new warfighting issues to address. What advice would you give to the commander to help him prioritize his efforts, particularly giving his new warfighting authorities and responsibilities?
Well, thanks, Kevin. And it is great to be with this group, most of whom I've worked for and some I've worked with. It brings back lots of memories, especially around things in Colorado Springs. To General Ashey's point earlier, you know, one of the things that we can't forget that there are people that have had experience in this domain that others haven't, and you're one of those, Chile. And I can remember when the Koreans launched that Taepodong, there was lots of kerfluffle. Did they really try to get to space? Because that was their claim. They put a satellite up there, and you walked through the command center, and I said, what do you think, Chile? You know, you've been there, and you looked at the profile of the launch, and you said, well, that's a profile to get to space. That's what we did in the shuttle all the time. So in 10 minutes, you figured it out, maybe on the back of an envelope. I think it took us 3 or 4 days with experts back in Washington stirring around trying to figure out what were they really trying to do. And they came to the same conclusion. The official conclusion was yes, but in Colorado Springs, because we had experience. So I guess one of the things is try to attract as much experience as you can. People that have been there and done that is really helpful. As far as New Space Command, we were given, at that time they called it computer network defense. And they just slung it to Space Command, U.S. Space Command. And their rationale was, well, you guys work in a virtual world, so this is a virtual world, go help defend our network. They really never gave us the authority to do that. We were never going to be a supported commander in an effort to defend our networks. And towards the end of my tenure, we finally had it outlined in one order that we did, in a quasi way, we're a supported commander in looking at one particular attack on our infrastructure, which was the start of things. But you know, these authorities, I would think for a new commander, it's something you have to watch all the time, because people will they're always trying to undermine you. You know, there's tribalism still exists. You can't convince me it doesn't still exist everywhere. Business, government, the military in particular, I think. We're proud of our tribes, and that's okay. But we've got to be cognizant that we have certain responsibilities and we don't give them up easily, and authorities that go with them. You know, you mentioned the new launch vehicles that came out of that time frame. What you didn't mention is when I first got there, we lost in quick order 3 Titan IVs and very expensive payloads, as you know, because that was our heavy lift vehicle. And the other advice I would give, besides finding people with experience, you can find people that can provide advice on processes, as we did with the group that General Ashey was on, to come look at our process for launch, from the launch pad through the wing to who built the rocket up, contractors. We looked at the whole thing, and we had, I think, 10 Titans to go, and every one of them was a perfect launch after this advice we got from, I think we called it the ISAG, General Ashey. But don't be afraid to ask for outside help. There's some people may not know a lot about space, but they know a lot about processes, and everything we do has to do with some of those processes. So I would not be bashful in making sure you're getting the right advice.
Great.
Just one other thing on that. you know, we talked about tribalism. We talked about how well the intel agencies are going to blend into this. Well, I'll be a believer when I hear about it. We met at Buckley, Air Force Space Command, U.S. Space Command, NSA, Ken Minahan, and Keith Hall from NRO. And the three of us owned a lot of those entities on Buckley. And we all agreed that we needed to blend these capabilities together, so from an intel standpoint, so we can provide what would have been probably the world's best fused intelligence document. And we gave our orders and we left Buckley and we came back 6 months later to ask how things were going. Nothing had happened. The bureaucracy, the captains, Navy captains, Air Force colonels, they decided it was too hard. And so I understand what I heard, I think, from Hal Estes, but you know, this is never goes away. This is a huge part of what the commander's responsibilities are, and you can't take anything for granted. It's really tough work to get people to do the right thing.
Great advice, sir. If I could follow up with you, you know, you had the unique perspective among all the panelists of after commanding U.S. Space Command to go on to be the vice chairman and then chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Does that perspective you gained there working that side of the problem, does that give you any other thoughts you'd like to share with U.S. Spacecom as they move forward?
A couple of them, and I think hope for General Raymond is that, and as he's probably well aware, and a lot of people in the audience are well aware, when we went into Iraq, phase 3 combat operations, we gave Central Command and their commander some control of space assets as we've never done before. Generally, these were assets that were highly classified. We didn't talk about them. We made sure combatant commands knew about them, but by golly, if they ever used them, they'd be used under the auspices of Air Force Space Command or whatever. So we broke all those paradigms. We got authority to use things in a way that leveraged what had happened in Desert Storm under General Horner's leadership. And I think it was a really good example of how that can be done. We took some risk. We took some of these risks that we would invent as we were doing our planning, didn't materialize in the way we thought they'd materialize in terms of impact on other assets in space and so forth. So I think that's if you don't know the history, you ought to go look at that history, because that's what has to be improved upon as we go forward. I love the document. I went through it at probably warp speed a couple of times, and I'm a land-grant university graduate, so it takes me a little bit longer, just like it does General Ashley, to kind of wade our way through these sort of things. But there was a word that was missing in that document. I didn't do a word search, but I did look for it, and maybe it's there. So I went through fast. I apologize. But I think the new Space Force, the new U.S. Space Command, has a real mission around integration. And I'd like to see the integration word used somewhere in the way they described what they're responsible for. And then finally, I just say that all of these words and all the wire diagrams are wonderful, and they look to be about right. But really, what's going to make all our Space Force and Space Command more effective in national security is going to be based on relationships, and relationships are based on trust. So if I were General Raymond, I'd waste no time making sure that I had building these relationships that have to be borne out over time, living up to what you say you're going to do, the trust, the integrity, all those sorts of pieces. That's what's going to enable things to go well when we have a threat in space, have to deal with something in space. And generally that's going to happen very quickly. We're going to have to react sort of instinctively. So hopefully the ground's been laid to do that, but that's going to be based on relationships, and those relationships built on trust. So that's probably the most important mission right now, in my view.
Great. Thank you, sir. Thanks for those words. Let me turn now to General Eberhardt. Sir, I believe you were just about to cut the ribbon on the new U.S. Space Command headquarters at Peterson when 9/11 happened, and the decision was made to move the mission to STRATCOM and to stand up a new combatant command, NORAD Northcom, which he became the first commander of. and by the way, I noticed you still cut the ribbon and moved into that building, which was a good move. But as the person who was thought to be the last commander of U.S. Space Command at the time, I'm sure you had some thoughts then about the decision to close down a combatant command with a singular focus on the space mission. Can you share the thoughts you had back then and any thoughts you have now pertaining to the decision to stand the command back up?
Shelley, I'd like to start with the thoughts I had immediately afterwards and the thoughts that I retain today. And in a word, it was a mistake to stand down U.S. Space Command. And I don't say that in criticism of any of the STRATCOM commanders or their staffs. It's certainly not Jim Ellis, as he assumed those missions. But if you look at their mission statement and you think about any of us in that position, you know well, STRATCOM, day in and day out, what's your number one priority? It's a nuclear enterprise. That's your number one priority. Space is not there all day, just pervasive in terms of what you and the staff do. I think it's also very interesting that against the backdrop of the Rumsfeld Commission and how the U.S. Space Force, Space Command, and the space professionals, what they contributed, what they did in both Gulf Wars, what they did in Bosnia, proven their worth in terms of what they provide in terms of support, but as has been mentioned earlier, as warfighters, as using tools for effect. So again, it was a mistake. So why did it happen? Why did it happen? Quite frankly, it was a bill payer. Now you'll read two different versions of this, actually on the STRATCOM, if you Google STRATCOM. One implies that they thought about this for a long time, and it was just a natural marriage and it was going to happen regardless. It doesn't even mention 9/11. Now, if those conversations were taking place, I certainly wasn't privy to those conversations as a U.S. Space Command commander. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that what drove that decision was a bill payer to stand up NORTHCOM, which turned out to be a very expensive bill payer in my mind, in terms of losing some of the momentum that we'd gained through all the previous commanders who are with us today. So as you look at that, and again, it's not criticism of STRATCOM, it's not criticism of Secretary Rumsfeld, which is interesting because it was the Rumsfeld Commission, and he was so high on space and how it should be addressed, how we should be organized and equipped. Frankly, we were thinking tactically when we should have been thinking strategically in terms of space. So long story short is that I applaud the stand-up of the Space Force. I applaud certainly the stand-up of U.S. Space Command. And I'll echo one of the things that we've heard time and time again here today. And I've talked to Jay Raymond about this at length. Also, I experienced it firsthand. The OSD and the Joint Staff and others in DC want to give you some responsibilities without the associated authorities. And they tried to do that to us time and time again. Don't make me responsible for something if I don't have the authority to execute. I don't have the authority to deliver. And I think Jay Raymond just went back again last week asking for some additional authorities so that he could execute his responsibilities.
Great. Thank you, sir. Thanks for your thoughts. Well, gentlemen, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left here. As I mentioned earlier, I'd like to go back once around the horn for everybody, maybe a minute each, if there's anything you want to add or redact from your previous comments. And then if we have a little time at the end, I've got another question I'd like to pose to the panel. So General Horner, back to you. Anything you'd like to add, having heard your colleagues here?
Well, it's interesting that we think so much alike, being so much difference in age from myself to some of those younger guys like Joe. But I think the Rumsfeld Commission actually did a great service when it really created what's now Space Force. It didn't the question was not whether to do it. The question was, when will the assets warrant such a creation? And so it's interesting that under Trump that we have gone there. It's still a small force, but certainly the responsibilities are appropriate. And it also sets the stage for going back into warfighting from a space aspect.
Great, thank you, sir. General Ashe?
I'd just like to put a plug in. You can't fight unless you got a command and control system that's effective so that you can operate inside the operation cycle of your opponent. So Jay's heard a lot about that from all of us. Having talked to him like Ed recently, he's been working that for a long time. I'm concerned about what we're all talking about, ways, means, and ends. You can't, if you don't have the authorities and the means to accomplish what you need, you're in trouble. So they're working on that. He assured us, as in the document, that he does have the authorities. They've had some breakthroughs, particularly with the intelligence community. And I don't understand the term all domain command and control. You know, as airmen, we created most of our effects in another domain. So that meant command and control was looking at other domains. So the 5 operational domains have to be dependent on each other, and you can't operate in today's modern battle space without that. So I think he's on that. I'm concerned, not in criticism of the Air Force versus the Space Force. When you went to 14th Air Force and looked at his intelligence support organization versus an AOC, any of the AOCs that we had in the world, there was a big disparity there. So I think Ed mentioned, you know, the means to get there. So it's a small force, but it needs some more people, the right people, as has been discussed here today. And I think they've been shortchanged. So there's a lot of issues still left to work, as we've all said here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
General Estes, any thoughts you'd like to add back in?
I got just a couple, Chili. Joe just talked about it a little bit, but the whole issue between Title 50 and Title 10 is a division that's got to be fixed. And at least based on what I can see, it isn't fixed. Jay has got some authorities that deal with the Title 50 assets that are at least written out. Now, whether or not that'll actually happen or not, we know the Space Defense Center that's out Schriever now is supposed to be a combined center to deal with those kinds of issues. But I think there's work to be done straightening out this problem we have, because it's like it's tribes, 2 different tribes. And they may say something, but they don't operate that way. And so we really do. Jay needs to really pay attention to that in his CSO hat. I think it's something that needs to be, that Secretary Barrett needs to pay attention to. They need to get on this thing, get it fixed. And there's some authorities that need to be granted both ways. So that's one thing I think that needs to happen that hasn't happened. The second thing we haven't talked too much about, because it's not, it's a major problem because it's so diverse right now, but it's not something that comes to mind immediately. And that's the whole acquisition process and how we acquire the systems we're going to need in the future. There's too many fingers in the pie, and there still are. And part of it's in Title 50, Title 10, but there's even more to it than that. And until they get that fixed, and I know they're not there, because we've all seen where they put some acquisition document together and it got pulled back by the administration, and guess who's working it? OMB. I don't understand that. Why is OMB working the acquisition document for space? But there's something going on there. I'm not privy to what it is, but caused them to pull this document back before it went to the Congress. Some work has got to be done there. If we have too many fingers in the pie in space acquisition, we're never going to get it right. And so we need to somehow pull that together. And I think that's another big challenge that General Raymond has going forward. So those would be my 2 comments.
Great, thanks, sir. We certainly can't afford to spread the acquisition talent thin. Concentrating would be a help. I think you're right. General Myers? General Myers, check your mic for unmute, please.
Do that. I am going to do that. Yeah, another button. I'm just going to pile on and show my cynical side. And when we had that computer defense mission, I went to one of the big intel agencies at the time before we had a DNI, and trying to make nice and figure out where the lines would be drawn. And they said, well, it's really simple. When we're at war, you got it. When we're at peace, we got it. I said,
No way.
okay, I'm thinking we're at war all the time. What do you think about that? And they said, we don't agree. And so, I mean, this is, you can say it's fixed, but I mentioned tribalism. That's why I mentioned it. This is going to require, and it's got to be one of the top priorities of the commander and his staff to continue to work this. They're not going to go in, and you can't say, I'm going to get to that next year. These are the kind of things when you're stood up and you have the authorities and the enthusiasm and the backing of the president and everything, you strike now. If you wait, you're going to get rolled. Now that's my cynical hat, but be that as it may. And then I also, I spent some time in acquisition, and I'll chime in on the acquisition piece. I think that's going to be a real issue until they get that sorted out as well. And the real issue there is we're going to have duplication, and we're going to spend more U.S. resources in a very inefficient way, which cause taxpayers to pay more for what we get. So that's my problem. Thanks, Kevin. Oh, by the way, Kevin, since you commanded U.S. Strategic Command, you probably have a perspective as well about that in Space Command. That'd be interesting to hear if we have time.
I do. I'll let General Eberhart talk, and then if we have a little time, I'll pitch in a couple cents here. So thank you. General Eberhart?
Chili, all I would add is that I wish we were doing this in person, live, and had a chance to go to the bar all together afterwards. So,
Amen.
Well, especially if Horner was buying.
exactly. Yeah,
He's
I
a
think
rich
the senior guy buys.
Well, thank you, guys. I'll just take a couple seconds here. I think you're right on the Title 50 thing. Anytime you mention the word reconnaissance and space in the same sentence, the intel agency say that's our job. Well, it is for national security, space, and support to the president. But that will always trump what the regional combatant commander needs day in and day out and in a fight, particularly when there are limited assets. So I think it's time now to move forward and say that U.S. Space Command is not only responsible for surveilling space as their own AOR to understand that for situational awareness, but they're in the perfect position to field a constellation of satellites that don't have exquisite resolution, but have good enough resolution. That's number one priority, is to support the regional combatant commanders in the fight so that they always have a dedicated asset at their disposal and don't have to risk being out prioritized. The other point I'd make is in my history of studying deterrence at Stratcom, in the history of the world, I've never seen a case where pure defense deterred anybody from going to war, with the Maginot Line being probably the most outstanding example of failure in that sense. And so to do part of the mission statement that I read earlier, we are going to have to field lethal offensive capability that will hold our adversary space assets at risk. Because the myth that they are not as dependent on these assets as we are is just that, a myth. They have become dependent on BEDAW, GLONASS, over-the-horizon comms, et cetera, for their targeting and command and control, missile warning. If they're going to hold our stuff at risk, we better be able to hold their stuff at risk, because the last thing we want to do is fight in a totally uneven battlefield. And if we can convince them that we are powerful enough to hold their assets at risk, then I think deterrence has a chance. And I'm a big proponent of deterrent warfare as opposed to fighting it. So that would be my couple cents I'd throw in here on the table at the end. But to you gentlemen, I just want to thank you for all your service to our nation and for participating in this panel. And so on behalf of Lieutenant General Wright, Orville, and the Air Force Association, I want to thank you for the time you've given us today to share your thoughts on the reestablishment of U.S. Space Command and what we need to do as we go forward to deter, and if that fails, fight and win in this new domain. God bless you all. Thanks for your participation out here.
Thank you.